So a little background, we're going to pick up with the Louisiana Purchase that Thomas Jefferson made under his presidency from Napoleon. And usually that's the version of events that we get, right? Thomas Jefferson purchased this unbelievable deal from Napoleon, who was in dire straits. There's a little bit more to the story that's kind of interesting. So actually, there was an American minister named Robert Livingston who was negotiating in Paris for a little window of time on behalf of the presidents. And he was actually trying to negotiate a deal for the Gulf of Mexico at New Orleans. Suddenly, out of this just kind of clear sky, the French foreign minister asked him how much he would give for all of Louisiana. Scarcely able to believe his ears, he was partially deaf anyhow, Livingston nervously entered into negotiations. And after about a week of haggling, while the fate of North America trembled in the balance, treaties were signed on April 30th of 1803, ceding Louisiana to the United States for about $15 million. When news of the bargain reached America, Jefferson was shocked and startled. He'd authorized his envoy to offer not more than $10 million for New Orleans and as much to the east of the Floridas as he could get for that much money. Instead, they had signed 3 separate treaties that pledged $15 million for New Orleans plus an immeasurable tract of land to the west, an area that would more than double the size of the United States. They had bought a wilderness to get a city. So pretty amazing stuff. America secured with just one stroke of the pen the western half of the richest river valley in the world and laid the foundation of this kind of agrarian republic that had been envisioned by Jefferson. He now thought that he had realized kind of this vast valley of democracy where he could have all these agrarian farmers with plots of land living on their own in a more sustainable way. And then, of course, he decides that now that they own it, they need to go off and explore it. So the enormous extent of the new area was more fully unveiled by a series of explorations under Jefferson's direction. In the spring of 1804, Jefferson sent his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and a young Army officer named William Clark to explore the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery ascended the Great Muddy, the Missouri River, from St. Louis and spent the winter of 1804-1805 with the Mandan Indians in present-day North Dakota. And there, aided by, a lot of people say Sacagawea, but I've been taught Sacagawea is the more proper native pronunciation. So aided by Sacagawea, the 33 adventurers, one died from illness in Iowa, by the way, struggled across the northern prairies through the Rockies, finally descending the Columbia River to the Pacific coast. Lewis and Clark's 2.5-year expedition yielded a rich harvest of scientific observations, maps, knowledge of the Indians in the region, hair-raising wilderness adventure stories. On the Great Plains, they marveled at the immense herds of buffalo, elk, deer, antelope feeding in one common boundless pasture. Lewis was lucky to come back alive when he and 3 other men left the expedition to explore the Marias River in present-day western Montana. A band of teenage Blackfoot Indians armed with crude muskets by British fur traders operating out of Canada stole their horses. Lewis foolishly pursued the horse thieves on foot. He shot one of the marauders through the belly, but the Indian returned the fire. Being bareheaded, Lewis later wrote, I felt the wind of the bullet very distinctly near me. After killing another Blackfoot and hanging one of the expedition's peace and friendship medals around the dead man's neck as a warning to the others, Lewis and his terrified companions beat it out of that country to rejoin the main party on the Missouri River. So lots of hair-raising adventures. Okay, now partly related to that is this Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton kind of conspiracy thing that happened. I want to tell you just a little bit about that. Why is that happening? Okay, so here's the deal. Aaron Burr was Jefferson's first-term vice president, and he spent he was in no small part responsible for really provoking and then justifying these kind of fears that the United States could kind of fall apart at this point. He was dropped from the cabinet of Jefferson's second term, and Burr joined with a group of Federalist extremists in a plot to break away from the United States. I read before that it had to do with New England states and New York breaking away, but I've also read that the Louisiana Purchase was one of the things that he was looking at, that it could break away and that he was going to kind of lead this kind of revolution and then become the leader of that particular territory. Alexander Hamilton, though, no real friend of Jefferson, found out about this and exposed and foiled the Aaron Burr plan. Incensed, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel, and Hamilton deplored the practice of dueling, but went anyway. He met Burr's challenge at the appointed hour, refused to fire supposedly, and Burr killed Hamilton with one shot to the gut. Burr's pistol blew the brightest brain out of the Federalist Party and destroyed its one remaining hope of effective leadership. Now, first of all, it didn't hit him in the brain, it hit him in the stomach. He died the day later. And there's also a lot of stories about whether Alexander Hamilton shot or not. It's said that at the very last minute, he shot in the air, but that was a story told by his own assistant. Burr's assistant says that he shot at him but missed, and that the return fire hit Hamilton. Either way, the duel that ensued killed Hamilton. Aaron Burr would then kind of lose prominence because people were frustrated, even though, duels weren't that uncommon at the time. The fact that he had killed someone, that was uncommon because the duels didn't usually lead to the death of another. So here's that story in 90 seconds.
Now for another 90-second history report.
Politicians fight. That's nothing new. You hear about it every day, but did you know that a cabinet member and a vice president once pulled guns on each other? Back in 1791, Aaron Burr took the New York Senate seat from incumbent Philip Schuyler, father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. You know, the guy on the $10 bill.
Now for another 90-second history report.
Father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. You know, the guy on the $10 bill. That made me mad. A few years later in 1800, the Electoral College can't decide between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr for president. Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, breaks a deadlock, calling Jefferson the lesser of two evils. Now I'm mad. Public name-calling continues for years, until finally, Vice President Aaron Burr challenges Alexander Hamilton to a duel. In July of 1804, the two met outside Weehawken, New Jersey. The story has it that Hamilton fired first with a shot near Burr's head. Burr responded with a shot in Hamilton's abdomen, which eventually kills him. Burr is later charged with murder. He serves no time, but his political career is ruined. Oh, no! So here it is in a nutshell. Two colonial heroes rose to fame. When things went bad, each used the other to blame. One lost his life, the other his name. Politics truly is a dangerous game.
That's the Burr and Hamilton duel in 90 seconds.
Okay, we're going to end the day with this, so we're going to not do that. So I'll tell you more about the Louisiana Purchase, which was really quite phenomenal, but we'll do that later on, okay? We are going to talk next about the War of 1812. So Jefferson easily won re-election in 1804, but a crisis clouded his second administration. Renewed fighting between Britain and France threatened American shipping. The crisis continued into the administration of James Madison, who was elected president in 1808. 4 years later, Madison led the nation into the War of 1812 against Great Britain. So Jefferson has now been replaced with Madison, and the War of 1812 will ensue. So let's take a look at that. The causes of the war. France and Britain both threatened the United States ships between 1805 and 1814. Americans focused their anger on the British, and one of the reasons for that was the British policy of impressment. Impressment was the practice of seizing Americans at sea and impressing or drafting them into the British Navy. Americans grew even angrier after learning that officials in British Canada were supplying arms to Native Americans in support of their ongoing battle against American settlers. A group of young congressmen from the South and the West, known as war hawks, demanded war. By the spring of 1812, President Madison had decided to commit America to war against Britain, and Congress approved the war declaration in mid-June. Republicans, funding cuts, and a lack of popular support had left the American military with few volunteers and ill-prepared for a war itself. Britain, however, was too preoccupied with Napoleon in Europe to pay much attention to the Americas. Nonetheless, the British scored a stunning victory in August of 1814 when they brushed aside the American troops and sacked Washington, D.C. Madison and other federal officials fled the city as the British burned the Capitol, the presidential mansion, and other public buildings. The most impressive American victory occurred at the Battle of New Orleans. There, on January 8th of 1815, U.S. troops led by General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee routed a British force. Ironically, British and American diplomats had already signed a peace agreement before the Battle of New Orleans, but the news of the pact hadn't reached Jackson in time. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve of 1814, declared an armistice, or an end to the fighting. The consequences of war. The war had three important consequences. First, it led to the end of the Federalist Party, whose members generally opposed the war. Second, it encouraged the growth of American industries to manufacture products no longer available from Britain because of the war. Thirdly, it confirmed the status of the United States as a free and independent nation. Nationalism shapes foreign policy. As with James Madison, foreign affairs dominated the first term of President James Monroe, who was elected in 1816. His Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, established a foreign policy based on nationalism, which is the belief that national interests should be placed above of regional concerns, such as slavery in the South or tariffs in the Northeast. High on Adams' list of national interests were the security of the nation and the expansion of its territory. Adams arranged the Convention of 1818, which fixed the U.S. border at the 49th parallel from Michigan west to the Rocky Mountains. Adams also reached a compromise with Britain to jointly occupy the Oregon Territory, the territory west of the Rockies, for 10 years. He'd also convinced Don Luis de Onis, the Spanish minister of the United States, to transfer Florida to the United States. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 also established a western boundary for the United States that extended along the Sabine River from the Gulf of Mexico north to the Arkansas River to its source, and then north to the 42nd parallel and west to the Pacific Ocean. When Napoleon invaded Portugal and Spain in 1807, the two countries did not have the money or military force to both defend themselves and keep control of their overseas territories at the same time. But when Napoleon was defeated in 1815, Portugal and Spain wanted to reclaim their former colonies in Latin America. Meanwhile, the Russians, who had been in Alaska since 1784, were also establishing trading posts in what is now California. In 1821, Tsar Alexander of Russia claimed that Alaska's southern boundary was the 51st parallel, just north of Vancouver Island, and he forbade foreign vessels from using the coast north of this line. So with Spain and Portugal trying to move back into their old colonial areas and with Russia pushing in from the northwest, the United States knew that it had to do something. Many Americans were interested in acquiring northern Mexico and the Spanish colony of Cuba. Moreover, the Russian action posed a threat to American trade with China, which had brought huge profits. So accordingly, in 1823, in his message to Congress, President Monroe warned all European powers not to interfere with affairs in the Western Hemisphere. They should not attempt to create new colonies, he said, or try to overthrow the newly independent republics in the hemisphere. The United States would consider such action dangerous to our peace and our safety, and at the same time, the United States would not involve itself in European affairs or interfere with existing colonies in the Western Hemisphere. These principles became known as the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine became the foundation for future American policy and represented an important step onto the world stage by an assertive, really young nation. At home, however, sectional differences soon will challenge national unity, requiring a strong patriotic sentiment and strong leaders like Andrew Jackson to hold the nation together. Okay, I'm going to go back. Do you see something now? Okay. And we'll end the day with the importance of this Lewis and Clark expedition.
In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte, the leader of France. Desperate for funds, Napoleon offered to sell the territory to the United States for $15 million. In what has been called the best purchase in the history of the United States, Jefferson agreed to the price. The Louisiana Territory doubled the current size of the United States, and today the territory makes up all or part of 14 states. Unsure of the bounds of the territory and interested in finding the elusive Northwest Passage, Jefferson selected his aide and friend Meriwether Lewis to explore the region. Lewis chose his former Army captain, William Clark, as his co-captain on the voyage. The voyage was named the Corps of Discovery and was given 3 goals by Jefferson. First, and most importantly, to discover the Northwest Passage, an all-water route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Second, the explorers were to document the geography and animal and plant life they saw. Third, they were to meet the Native American tribes and extend to them the full fellowship of the United States. The Corps left from St. Louis, Missouri in May of 1804. They traveled on water wherever possible and wintered in present-day North Dakota with the Mandan Native Americans. The help of the Mandan Native Americans was invaluable to the Corps of Discovery. During the winter, Lewis and Clark were introduced to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper, and his wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. Charbonneau and his wife were invited to be a part of the expedition, as Sacagawea could serve as a useful interpreter for the Corps. A few months after they met, Sacagawea gave birth to a boy named Jean-Baptiste. Clark and the other members of the expedition nicknamed him Little Pomp. From the Mandan Native Americans, the expedition traveled west. The terrain became more rugged, and there became fewer navigable rivers to traverse the area. Upon meeting with the Shoshone Native Americans, Lewis and Clark attempted to negotiate for horses to carry them across the Rocky Mountains. As leader of the Shoshone tribe, Chief Camoet was reluctant to help the Corps until he met Sacagawea. When she was young, Sacagawea had been kidnapped from her people and sold to Charbonneau, who later married her. When Sacagawea was called upon to help interpret for Lewis and Clark, she realized that Chief Camoet was her brother. Because of this discovery, the Corps was able to obtain the horses and supplies they would need to cross the Rocky Mountains and reach the Oregon coast. From the Shoshone tribes in northern Idaho, Lewis and Clark were able to ride the rivers through northern Oregon and reach the Pacific Ocean.
Ocean in view. Oh, the joy.
Lewis and Clark wintered in a fort that they had built named Fort Clatsop. When spring came, the Corps began their long journey home. Although they did not discover the Northwest Passage, the Corps of Discovery successfully completed their other objectives. They created good relationships with the Native American tribes that they encountered. They accurately mapped the region that they traveled, creating approximately 140 maps of the territory. They also documented and discovered over 100 species of animals and approximately 176 plant species. The expedition even sent a caged prairie dog to Thomas Jefferson, as the animals had never been seen in the East before. From the wide and flowing Mississippi to the mossy trails in Oregon, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had traversed the country, ending their journey after 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days.